episode. I have with me a guest from the UCLA's economics department, Adriana Lleras-Muney. She's written a lot of papers in her career on topics in mortality, health, education, and they're oftentimes these really big projects, big in lots of different ways, big as in massive data sources. She was probably one of the people when I graduated in '07 and I just kind of started to see her publications. I noticed that the data sources were huge. So that was one thing about her. But it's not just that. It's also she studies these big major events in American history, particularly the earlier part of the last century. Things like the New Deal having a youth employment program and the impact, the long-term impact that it had on those workers, those young people, or the impact of the sulfa drugs becoming available on mortality. So there's that, but she's also very non-dogmatic, very creative, meticulous person. And so I was really looking forward to having her on the podcast, but I was also looking forward to having her on the podcast because we've gotten to actually be somewhat uh, good acquaintances. And I was really looking forward to just hearing her story because I really didn't know it. And I bet a lot of people don't know it. So in this week's episode, we spent a long time just her sharing her story growing up in Colombia. She had a very unusual educational journey that was different than really anyone that I had spoken to before. Everybody's story is obviously different, but there's a lot of common stories for people that go through either an education system in Europe or an education system in the United States. And for some reason, Adriana's story was really didn't fit anything I'd heard before. And the other thing that really surprised me was how she explained what really grabbed her and brought her into economics as a field. And I'm going to just let her share it. I was not expecting it. It's not a big deal, but I still just keep thinking how everybody gets into this field such their own way. Let's just say it like that. So this was a wonderful interview. I really enjoyed it. I'm glad, so glad she agreed to be on the podcast. I'm so glad that she was so generous with her time and so candid and really generous with her spirit as she shared everything. So I'm going to turn it over to her now and to myself now, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks so much for tuning in. And as always, thank you for supporting the podcast and listening to it. I hope that this is an episode that you find a lot of value in. Thanks. And greetings from Italy. I'm here for another week and a half. So greetings. Okay, well, this is a lot of fun. I'm gonna let you introduce yourself, but I will say that this is the first time that we've gotten to meet, but we've talked for a long, long time. Uh, Adriana Lleras-Muney. I didn't say it right though, did I?
Not quite, but it's
I've been
fine.
practicing all day, and I can't because I went to Mississippi public schools. I can't do it right. How do I say it?
Lleras-Muney.
Yes, Lleras-Muney. Okay. For the sake of the listener, can you tell us, you just said it, your full name, but your full job title and who pays your salary?
I'm a professor of economics at UCLA.
Okay, great. All right. We're going to start with an icebreaker. What is a vacation that you have taken in your life maybe it wasn't necessarily your favorite vacation, but it's one that you have noticed that you will sometimes think about. It'll pop in your mind every now and then.
I think the trip that I took that probably was most influential in my life was a trip to China my husband and I took after I graduated from Columbia after my PhD. And so we went backpacking in China for about 7 weeks. We
Wow.
bought a ticket into Beijing and out of Hong Kong 7 weeks later. And we had
Wow.
no reservations for anything.
Oh my
And we
God.
do not speak Chinese. We don't have a guide or anything. And so we did that and we went all over the place and it was quite an adventure.
Wow. sleep. It was you were camping.
Not really. We took a backpack. We took pretty much every mode of transportation. We did go camping for a couple of days in northern Sichuan. But the rest of the time we just stayed in very cheap hotels and
Mhm.
we went by bus and by bicycle and by pretty much any mode of transportation. We didn't,
Wow.
we
Whose
did it
idea
on
was that?
very cheap. Huh?
Whose idea was that?
Well, I wanted to do something memorable after graduating from graduate school. Graduate school was hard. It was really,
Yeah.
really hard. And I knew that I was starting another hard part of my life, going
Mm,
as an assistant professor.
mm,
And and so we wanted to do something memorable, but I also felt this was this magic moment in life where like I had like a real break in some sense. I had defended my dissertation, I had graduated, I had sent off my job market paper, and
yeah.
like I was like, I have like this magic moment of a
Oh,
real break.
that's so romantic. That's so cool. I've never done anything really like that. That must have been just so that was a wonderful. You still think about that from time to time?
We think about that a lot. Yeah, we think
Uh,
about that a lot. And I think about this also when I talk to my kids because I often think about what it meant for people who like traveled to the Americans in the 1600s or something, what that was like. But for my kids to think that I went to China without speaking Chinese and without a phone, just old maps and stuff like that, they think it's crazy. They look
that's,
at us and they think we're insane.
well, what was the coolest thing that you saw that surprised you?
Uh, the coolest thing that we saw. I don't know. That's a hard question. I don't know if I'm going to have like a good anecdote on the spot, but we we met a lot of really interesting people that were there, the ones
Mm,
that were willing to talk to us
mm,
about the country. So what was hard about that trip is that really the very large majority of people, almost everyone, did not speak English at all. So it was
mm.
hard to communicate with them. But we did meet a few people that spoke English, and it was really fascinating to talk to them.
That is the coolest thing. That's and just doing it for so long and so radical like that. That's cool. Well,
Okay, I'll tell you one anecdote. Coolest
yeah.
thing that happened to us may have been that we were on the area bordering what is now formerly to a former Tibet. Well, it is Tibet, but close to it in Sichuan province, there are a bunch of areas next to it that are part of the former area of Tibet. And so the culture is still very Tibetan. And we
Mm,
went on a long hike in this area, and we ran into a group of monks that
mm,
were moving from place to place and
mm,
playing soccer. And so we played soccer with them, and they built a huge tent and they invited us to go into it, and they made momos for us on the spot. So they had like the dough and they had the meat from yaks, which are these like cows with very long hair that live
uh-huh.
high up in the mountains, and they
Oh,
made them and boiled them right on the spot for us, and we had this lunch with them. It was incredible, and then we left.
that's amazing.
Yeah,
That would have blown my mind. That's
yes.
unreal. Wow, what a cool thing that you and your husband got to do together. Well, so where did you grow up anyway?
I grew up in Bogota, in Colombia.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, what did your parents do for a living when you were little?
My dad had a bunch of jobs, but what most of the time he had an economics consulting firm, and
Hmm.
then at some point when I was 11, he gave that up to become a full-time writer, musician, and producer of music and books. And that's what he did for the rest of his life.
Wait,
I,
how old were you when he did that?
11.
Wow. Were you surprised? Was the family surprised, or was he always really creative?
Oh, well, his story is interesting, but he was very creative when he was young, and he had done the piano for a long time, and he had published a book of poetry and a book of short
Mm,
stories. But people didn't think that was serious, and his parents strongly discouraged him from pursuing those interests.
mm,
He had won a scholarship to study piano and stuff, but his family disapproved. So
mm,
he eventually went and did economics and got a master's, and he got like what was considered a proper job
mm.
and a proper family and all of that. But then when my dad was around 40, he had a heart attack. And after that, he had some serious life rethinking that he did. And I think after that, he decided, that he needed to do something else. And he went back to these early loves of his.
Oh, that's wild.
So we
Wow.
weren't surprised in that he always played the piano, and I knew that he had published these books. We had them at home.
Huh.
Um, so in that sense, it wasn't a surprise, but it was quite the change for us.
Wow. What did your mom do?
And my mom was a stay-at-home mom.
Hmm. So did y'all stay when he changed his career like that? Did y'all stay in the same place that you had grown up?
Well, yeah, um we lived in Bogota, yeah.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. Well, what kind of games did you like as a kid?
Well, my family is very big into card games.
Oh
So
yeah.
my mom and my grandmother always played bridge.
Yeah.
And I didn't learn how to do that for a while, but we played a lot of other card games. So
Hmm.
that was big for us as a
Yeah,
family.
the card games where like everybody plays, like it's 4 to 8 people, like that, like bridge or spades or something.
No, like four people. There's always four people games, but there's a game called Hearts here
Yeah.
that people play that's similar to the kinds of games that we used to play.
Mm,
Like, so you have to
mm,
count the cards and all sorts of things like that.
yeah. Yeah. Boy, everybody's parents was like anybody's parents that played bridge or hearts, the parents are basically borderline geniuses at those games. And like, I was like, I would hear stories about friends who were like just as good as their parents, and I was like, "What are you, a genius?" I couldn't even come close to my parents' skill level at any of those games. But we played cards too growing up, and that was so I loved it too.
I don't
So
like it anymore. It's kind of interesting.
yeah, I don't play it either. Well, you gotta have like a bunch. Well, yeah, yeah, I don't play it either, but I did have fond memories of it. Well, so when you were in middle school, what'd you want to be when you grew up?
Oh, well, there was an evolution. I think when I was young, I wanted to be a dancer.
Oh,
And then, very quickly I understood like that was not gonna be a successful path for me, uh,
yeah.
economically. And, when my father had this big life crisis, he actually left the home.
Mm,
Um, and so he was separated and eventually divorced from my mom, and that lasted many years. Um, and so I saw my mom kind of as a separated woman
mm,
struggled tremendously economically.
mm,
There was a lot of instability and uncertainty surrounded that. And that affected me a lot. I looked at that situation and I thought to myself, that's not going to be me. My
mm,
mom had gone to college, but she didn't graduate because she married my dad and she decided to like do that and have children. And then, when she was 40 or 45, my dad left, and back in Colombia at that point, it's very difficult for her to go back and get a
mm,
job and make a living for herself. And I just remember thinking like, over my dead body, am I going to be in this situation? And so,
right.
you know, quickly it was becoming pretty clear. So then I wanted to be a lawyer after that.
Huh.
And so I love to arguing um, and debating with people. And so I thought law would be good for me. But I also had decided at some point I was growing up that I wanted to leave Colombia. I didn't want to be there. And at some point, it was pretty clear to me, like I understood that law is actually not very portable.
Mm,
You study law in Colombia, you can practice in Colombia and nowhere else. You have to restart at other places.
mm,
And practicing in Colombia, not only did I not want to stay in Colombia, but I also um, didn't think I want to practice in Colombia because I was interested in like criminal law and things like that.
mm.
And it was a dangerous place for lawyers at that time.
Oh,
Um,
really?
a lot of lawyers and a lot of, judges would end up, there was the same, like judges were either corrupt or dead.
Ah,
And if there's somebody in my family who married um, into a family where the mom had been a judge and she was actually killed. Uh,
oh
so
gosh.
this was kind of like a close to home issue. So, that like ruled out law. So then I kind of was like, okay, well, I'm a good student and I like a lot of the subjects. I was tracked into math and science because I went to a French school
Mm,
from age 5 to 17, and the French track their students into different topics, and they track the good students into math and physics, uh,
mm,
if they can convince them. So I was actually interested in economics, and they have an economics tracks,
mm,
but they're like, no, if you want a scholarship and if you want to like do economics, you need to do math and physics. So I did
mm.
math and physics, but I really did not like physics. That was really not my thing. Physics, chemistry, and whatever. So it was pretty clear to me like that was not going to be an engineer or a doctor or a biologist or any of those things.
That was high school?
That was high school. And so then,
Wait,
then
before you get to physics though, it's like you knew that you liked mathematics.
well, I was a good student and I like pretty much all the topics that I love reading. I love reading books. I was good at that. I liked languages. I was like a super nerd.
Mm.
Everybody in my school knew I was a nerd. I was
But
not
then you
popular because of being a nerd. I was just like,
hit
I was just one of those kids. I was always raising my hand and I was like one of these people.
but then you hit physics and it was like a course you did not like.
I did not like, no.
Hmm.
Part of it, I think, is that I was kind of forced into it,
Hmm.
but I did not like that. No.
Hmm. So that's where is it in high school that you start mulling over being a lawyer? Is that in high school? Yeah, all the
No,
way back?
that was even before. No, even before.
Oh.
I was like, if you had asked me when I was 13 and like 14, I would be like, I'm gonna be a lawyer.
And some of that was because you saw how much your mom was struggling economically.
I wanted to, so basically, I didn't want to struggle economically. And in Colombia at that point, I had this narrow vision. I don't know who gave it to me, but the idea was like, you can be a doctor, an engineer, a lawyer, an economist, and the rest is risky,
Mhm.
uncertain, possibly bad, you know.
Yeah.
Kind
Yeah.
of idea. So
Right.
I didn't really think there were that many options for me to explore.
Right.
So law seemed very appealing until I discovered that it was dangerous and that I could not leave the country with it. And then
Uh-huh.
I was not sure what I was going to do for a while. So I was sure that I wanted to leave Colombia. So that I wanted to do. And the best way for me to do that was to be the number one person in my school and get a scholarship to go to France. And so I set that as my goal. Um, and the French would want to give that scholarship to the person who was in math and physics. So I did that because that was my goal. Sadly, I didn't get the scholarship. My best friend did. So I did not get to go to France right after I graduated. And then I was like, okay, what am I going to do? And I wasn't sure what to do. So I started college in Columbia in program called Finance and International Relations. And it was a program that appealed to me precisely because it enforced me to choose. it had a lot of, it was very interdisciplinary. So I learned Italian, law, math, statistics, economics, history. And I was like, that's awesome. I like all of these subjects. But at the end of that year, my dad got a job in Paris, as it turns out. And so I jumped at the opportunity to move to France, which is what I had been looking forward or trying to do. And I did not achieve by myself, but I still got the chance to go. And so I went with him, and I restarted college when I came to France.
Wait, so I have you on your Vita graduating from Louisiana State University. Can you
Yes.
tell how both of those fit together?
Well, so I came to France and I restarted college, and at that point I started economics, a degree in economics. The French did not really give me credit for anything that I had done in Colombia in that year. And so I restarted. And then in my first year there, I had an English professor who eventually I married. And that's how I got to Louisiana State University.
Oh,
So
wow.
basically, he was my English professor, and he was here taking a leave of absence from law school. He was doing law school in Louisiana State University. He came here to teach, and at the end of that year, he went back to Louisiana State, but he asked me to marry him. And I stayed in France for one more year, and we planned our wedding, and we planned my transferring and all of that. And so I followed him, and I moved from Paris to Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Wow.
And
Wow.
so I did one year in Colombia, 2 years in France, and then I moved to LSU, and LSU actually gave me credit for everything that I had done before. So
Yeah.
I went there and they're like, we'll give you credit for this, that. At the end of it, I had only 1 year of college. And they're
Huh.
like, you've done pretty much almost all the economics you need and everything. And so my last year of college was very peculiar compared to Americans because I had to take a few econ courses to satisfy their residency requirement. But aside from that, what I was missing the most were their general education requirements. So I did ceramics, geography, biology,
Yeah.
history of modern art. It was weird, the things that
Yeah.
people do the first year of college.
First
But I
year.
did also take a few econ classes, and those were very influential in my decision to go to economics PhD.
Why? What happened in those classes?
Well, first of all, the teachers were great. I was very lucky. These advanced classes had very few students in them, and the professors could spend a lot of time with the students that were there. And so I really enjoyed that. Um, and so I was thinking about going to graduate school. And believe it or not, I hesitated between going to graduate school from comparative literature, and that's because I spoke, French and Spanish and in English, and I liked reading, or economics.
Hmm.
The English teacher made it pretty clear that that was a pretty rough career to do.
Hmm.
And so I thought like, okay, well, maybe that's not so good. Then I went to talk to an econ professor there, and he said, he's like, well, you're either very good in math and you're going to be like a theorist or something like that, or you're very good in statistics and then you can do applied work. And if either of those are not your thing, then don't go to graduate school.
Did you kind of feel like that resonated with you when he said that?
Well, I took it at face value. I don't know. The guy seemed to know what he was talking about. And
Yeah.
I thought to myself, this is gonna be nailing the coffin. Because as it turned out in France, when I had done economics, stats was one of my weakest subjects. I really
Hmm.
didn't like it very much. And so I
Hmm.
thought to myself, okay, well, there's an econometrics class here, and I'm gonna sit in it, but I think I'm gonna hate it, and then that's gonna, you know, be the end of this.
Hmm.
So I went to that class, and the professor was amazing. I
Hmm.
loved the class, and he was incredibly influential. In fact, he, like you, wrote an undergraduate textbook that
What's
was
his
very,
name?
very popular. Uh, so uh, the the name of the professor,
Yeah.
Now I'm not gonna remember. Oh, how embarrassing.
I Well,
Okay.
if it comes back to you, that's cool. So the when you were at that econometrics class, what was it about the econometrics class that affected you, but the stats classes had just done nothing to move you?
Well, so no, I'm gonna have to figure out the name of my professor because I'm just very embarrassed. Okay, well, the thing that made it great, and I think what made him great, um, was that the way I'd been taught in France, statistics was like a branch of mathematics. You know,
Uh,
40% of the exams were to write, you had to write a program in Pascal to do
mm,
things like computer mean or whatever it was. And so, but the fact is that I saw a computer once in 2 years. So
mm,
you'd write this program and then you'd be with pen and paper pretending to be the computer doing the loop like for I equals 1 to 100. You fill out the matrix and figure out like is your program doing the right thing or something like that,
That's
you know?
hilarious.
And the other 60% was like doing proofs and stuff like that. And
Huh.
like when I had taken those courses as a result of this, for me, it was extremely abstract. Like, what was this about? Like, okay, we do those proofs and all of this. I don't understand it. In this class, I finally understood he was talking about data. It's kind of hard to convey this, but like, you know, we actually had data, we worked with data, we were in a computer, and he
Mm,
talked about like actual examples of things, and he was very intuitive. He was extremely
mm,
good at explaining what was going on. I mean, we also did proofs and things like that,
mm,
but for me now it kind of was interesting now
yeah.
because I understood kind of what it was about
Mm,
and that it was about the world. And so and he was also just a very good teacher, you know.
mm,
And
mm,
he would be there and be in office hours and all of that. So it's kind of incredible when you think back in time how influential certain professors are in your career and like the ones that are mean to you or are not good, they leave an impression about the subject. And it's unfortunate, like some subjects you probably hate because you had bad teachers in them, and that's the only explanation.
right.
And this subject, like I had a great teacher in it, and it
Mm,
really made a difference. So I'm like, okay, I aced that class, and I'm like,
mm,
I'm going to graduate school. And that's
right.
essentially what happened.
Wow. Wow. So it was an econometrics class that partly
Yeah,
captivated. Wow, that's
yes.
cool. Wow. So you go to Columbia University, you get a master's there in 98. So does that mean you graduated college around 96?
I graduated in 96 and then I went to graduate school for 5 years and then I
Yeah.
graduated in 2001. That's
Okay.
right.
Okay. So what were you expecting graduate school to be like? And as you're going to Columbia, that must have been so exciting also just to go to a top university like that, also for graduate school. But uh, what were you expecting that for the PhD in economics to be like? And then what was it? How was it similar and how was it different from it when you got there?
I had no idea what I was getting into is the answer. You know, I had been in the United States for 1 year. I didn't have any, family aside from my husband's family, and they were not academics or knew nothing about this.
Mm,
So I really didn't have like a good idea of what this was. I understood that if you wanted to be a professor, you had to get a PhD. And I like the idea of being a professor,
mm,
but I had not understood that in fact the PhD was not oriented towards teaching at all.
mm,
This is like misconception that a lot of people still have to this day anyway. They think professors' primary occupation is teaching and that the
mm,
primary purpose of a PhD is to learn how to teach others,
right.
you know. And I had that misconception myself, and I thought that's what I was going to be doing. And I am a professor and I do teach, but of
Mm,
course the biggest surprise is like, no, it's all about research
mm,
and it's teaching you how to be research, and there's very little pedagogy or anything that's aimed towards the specific objective of being a teacher or
right. Right.
and so that was something that I hadn't understood, but it was fine in the sense that I was a studious, curious person, and so this was like a natural thing for me to do. And so
Mm,
it wasn't like a bad surprise or like, oops, I made a mistake.
yeah,
It was perfectly fine for me to do this. It was just something I hadn't realized that's what I was going to be end up doing.
yeah.
So that was kind of a surprise. I think that the PhD was very difficult for me.
Mm,
Some people had like a blast in graduate school, and every time I meet people like that, I'm like, who are you and where did you go to school?
yeah, right, right.
Um, so I definitely felt when I arrived there that the level of difficulty was like much higher than undergrad. I had done very well undergrad in all these places that I had been at.
Hmm.
But it was really a challenge. And when I went to graduate school, I felt like there were many people that were technically better prepared than I was, and
Mm,
better prepared in terms of knowing where they were headed and all of that.
mm,
I think one thing that was very difficult in graduate school was that at the time, the way it was structured at Columbia was I got in with a scholarship. The scholarship paid for the first year. And then there
mm,
was a promise that if I did well and depending on funding, this could be renewed. But it
mm,
was pretty clear to me at the time, because of my personal situation, that if I didn't get a scholarship going forward, I would have to stop the PhD. And because of
mm,
the way that it was allocated, it was competitive and it was
mm.
stressful. At the end of the first year, they would look at people, rank them, and say, this is how much money we have, and this is how many people we're going to fund.
So you were already knowing going into that first year, you were going to have to be kind
Yes.
of better than what the median student or something. You
Well,
didn't
it
really
was
know the cutoff
unclear
point?
how many people they would ultimately, they didn't tell you, well, we're going to fund half of the class or all of the class. Maybe they funded everyone, but they
Yeah.
never said, right? They never said anything. So you're like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And every year was like that.
Mm.
So, so
Every
yeah,
year,
every
you
year.
faced uncertainty every year.
Absolutely.
Whoa.
So every
Wow.
year was like, what's going to happen next year?
Oh my gosh. What were they making the decisions on? Your grades? Because it
Yes.
begins with grades.
Great. But I mean, I applied for fellowships and I got
Yeah.
jobs and other things. I held the
Yeah.
job all pretty much every year after the first year. So
Yeah.
it was that. But, so that was kind of very stressful. And Columbia was a great place to be, but it was expensive. It was in New York, and I had a lot of student debt that I had to pay with my
Right.
husband. So that money part was unexpected and stressful. And it also made for not a great ambience with the other graduate students.
I was
Because
going to ask that.
yeah. I mean,
Because
I made really good friends, but it wasn't a very collegial type of place at that time.
there was this like winner take all kind of thing where somebody wins and that means somebody else is going to go down. Is that kind of the thing?
Yeah, I think so. I had my friend that I studied with, but it wasn't like everybody was trying to help everybody else.
Right. Right. But I guess am I putting words in your mouth, but I guess that made your relationship with your husband really special because you knew he wasn't trying to ding you. He's in your corner.
Well, I don't know. I never thought about it that way. I mean, Colombia at the time was a somewhat unhappy place. There was a lot of upheaval. So the other thing that was a little bit strange is that um, a lot of the faculty weren't quite around, and they weren't, I don't know, they weren't quite as happy. And also I had the misfortune, I understood that I wanted to do labor really early on. And
Yeah.
Jacob Minster was there. And so I was very much looking
Oh,
forward to taking his class because he was like a giant in
yeah,
labor.
he's a legend. Yeah.
And so my second year, going into that, it was supposed to be the second semester. And the December, right before that course started, he had a heart attack and he retired.
Uh,
So I
what was
didn't get
that? That
to,
would have been like that was the mid 90s. That
that
was
was
like
in the 90s,
97 or
late
something.
90s. Yeah,
Ah,
exactly.
So you missed him by just a little bit.
I missed him just by a little bit. That's right.
Ah, I've just heard when I interviewed some of Becker's students that were at Columbia, like Mike Grossman and Bob Michael, and even Shoshana Grossbart, who wasn't at Columbia, but they just said, it wasn't, it was this Becker Mincer combo. Mincer was just so special as a professor to all the students at Columbia. Wow, that's really well. So what was it that made you get drawn towards labor then? How did that happen? Well, you said Mincer, but what was it that was even catching your eye before that?
Well, it's interesting. I think going into graduate school, I really wanted to do macro. That had been my favorite as an undergrad, my favorite topic.
Hmm.
And micro theory, I thought was the most boring thing ever.
Uh-huh.
I really wasn't interesting so much. But then when I got to graduate school, um, I was very disappointed by macro at the time, really. And the reason for it was that it seemed that it was not intellectually cohesive. There were a lot of different methods used. The methods were all extremely difficult. So, I did macro as one of my fields. It was fine, but it was very demanding technically. And but it was so varied, and I couldn't quite, it wasn't like a core way of thinking that unified a lot of the things that people were talking about. But the other super disappointing thing about it, for me, at the time, the way it was taught, was that there was really no data, no empirical things. So all the debates were like, well, I can imagine this model, and here's a model of unemployment with shoe leather costs. And I'm like, what does that mean in the real world? Why is this relevant? Like, why are you writing that model? And there was
Hmm.
very little engagement, I thought, with data. And we had very few discussions in class that had to do with anything that was actually happening in the world. Like, here's this paper, and like, here's what happened in Argentina with inflation, here's your paper of inflation. No, that was never like that. It was like, always it was just theory, theory, theory.
Hmm.
I just grew very disenchanted uh, from that approach. I just didn't understand why we weren't talking about real world problems. Like a lot of like third world people, I was interested in why are some countries poor and others rich, and how do people get out of poverty or countries get out of poverty? Why are there things like inflation? Like, I like these big kind of questions. And I
Hmm.
just didn't think that macro was providing the answers. And in fact, I was very lucky. The one professor that did come when I was at Columbia was Xavier Sala y Martin, and
Oh,
he taught growth, and he was the only person that actually did data work, who actually tried to confront.
when did he get there?
I think he got there at the same time I got there.
But that wasn't enough to pull you in?
Um, well, I thought I just ultimately thought that the labor people were saying more interesting things. Like the growth stuff that we were doing at the time was, I don't know this, well, it was interesting, but also a little disappointed in that you had these very stylized growth models.
Yeah.
And, and so I was interested in things like inequality. Why is inequality rising? Or unemployment? Why is unemployment? And these growth models weren't doing that. You were running
Right.
regressions on growth rates, on
Yeah.
initial conditions, and throwing in a bunch of variables.
Yeah.
I was interested, and I did take those courses, but I just wasn't as inspired. When I sat in the labor classes, I just was much more interested in the things that they were studying.
Yeah.
And they
Yeah.
were also using the kind of individual data. So ultimately, I kind of felt that the things I was interested in studying, they were being studied by labor economists
Right.
and not so much by macro people.
Well, so how do you end up finding your dissertation topic and who do you end up working with?
Also a long story. I kind of was unhappy in graduate school, and I set myself a goal when I finished classes. I'm like, I need to get out of here as soon as possible. And so I was, I wasn't earning a lot of money. It was stressful. I had debt, and I wasn't enjoying this, but I'm like, I'm not going to quit. Although I thought about it, but I didn't. So I just, I worked on something for my third year and blah, blah, blah. I tried to get data for it. And towards the end of that year, somebody said to me, well, if you're working on this, you need to, why don't you go talk to Sherry Gleed? Because there may be some data in the health sector that you can use for that.
You were
And
thinking about labor and health, kind of this
I
connection.
was I was working on volunteerism at the time, on why,
Mm.
why people volunteer and how firms use volunteers.
Oh,
There's a lot of volunteers in the health. And I was trying in this health sector, and I was trying to find data on that.
yeah,
So I went
right.
to talk to her about it. And it was this life-changing conversation because, um, and I feel bad about it even as I talk about it now, but I went to her office and she's like, tell me about your project and what are you doing? How can I help you? And all of that. So we started this conversation. And at some point she's like, but why are you doing this? And I'm like, gave some explanation. And then she's like, but why do you care? And I tried to give an explanation. And she said, no, 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 no. Why do you, Adriana, care? Like, not like the royal, like, what do we care about? But like, why are you interested in this? And like, why do you think this is important? And I couldn't answer that question.
Yeah,
And
right.
I was very embarrassed when that happened because I felt really bad. And it was this moment, like we both knew this was bad. And I knew it. And I left. And I came back home and I told my husband, I'm like, I have to stop working on this project because I felt like a fraud. I'm like, what am I doing with my life? Like I can't
Yeah,
do this.
right.
I've been working on this for a year, but like, I can't do it. I can't do it because obviously I don't care about it. And maybe it's interesting and maybe it isn't. But if it's not interesting to me, I'm not going to convince anybody else. And
Mm.
even if I could, why should I do this if I cannot justify this to myself? So I had like a big crisis there. And I decided I would get all these jobs during the summer and try to figure out what else I could do.
You were thinking about leaving.
Well, I was like, I need to work. I need to find something else to do or some dissertation topic or something else. So I did research work for somebody. I think that was a nonprofit in New York. And then I got also hired by SSRC, the Social Science Research Council. And that was very interesting experience because the person who hired me there took me to Virginia, where they were doing these summer sessions. They were bringing, the SSRC had gotten a bunch of money to get graduate school students in their first and second years. And they had this idea that they wanted to help them launch these students into research. So they brought them to this place in Virginia, in super fancy place. And they got all the best students that they could hire. And then they brought like top people in the profession to come talk to them about it. And like, in the year that I did it, they had Steve Dorla, for example, came and talked about social interaction models, and um, they had like really excellent people. So it was for a week. It was in a fancy place. They treated you like royalty, which was kind of nice for a graduate student. And
Mm.
in there, I met a lot of people that are still, I met Till von Wachter, who's my co-author. I met Roland Fryer, Alex Savinsky, Sarah Reber. I met a lot of people who were at other programs. And that was a really interesting experience, actually. So I like doing that. So I came back and I was thinking, what am I going to
That
do?
was that. That was the summer
That was that
between,
summer.
between I don't actually care about this project, and then you go be around all these people at SSRC. And what are you seeing? What is okay? I didn't mean to get ahead of it, but is something positive is happening being around all these people from these other peers at other schools?
Well, I think what was interesting there was that um, there was this place where people were brainstorming, and that was fun and
Yeah.
interesting. And I also I felt bad because I didn't get selected for that program. I wasn't one of the people who'd won the scholarship to go there. I was actually kind of like the assistant to the guy that organized it.
Oh.
But essentially I got in through the back door and I was allowed to attend all the sessions and talk to all the students. And, I kind of thought, I'm not so different from these people. I
Yeah.
can also do this stuff. But it was just more fun. It was just more fun to be there with all these smart people, and they were all talking about research and they were all kind of talking about ideas. It was more like what I imagined things should be like, what I had hoped that it would be
Mm,
like. So it was more fun. But at the end of that summer, I still was there without like any topic in mind. And so I
mm,
was sitting in the like central area of the university, and Sherry Gleed came by again. And she's like, "Oh, hey, how are you doing?" And blah blah blah. And I'm feeling bad. And she's like, "Why don't you just come talk to me one day and see?
mm.
You can do something in health." Because she was like, "Did you find the topic?" And I'm like, "No." And the thing is that I was conflicted at that time because I wanted to do something in labor. And she was like a health economist. And I felt like that's not what I wanted to do. So I'm
You
like,
weren't interested in health. You were interested in labor. She didn't do any.
yes. I was like, what am I gonna go talk to her about? But then at some point I realized, well, this is kind of stupid. Like I don't know anything about health,
Yeah.
economics. I've never taken a class. I don't know anything. Why am I not interested in that? Why am I ruling this out without even giving it a shot? So I went and I got a book and I started reading it. And then I went to her office and I said, okay, I kind of read this undergraduate textbook and I have three ideas. She's like, what are your ideas? And I said, this, that. And so the first one we discussed, and she's like, that's too hard. You're never going to be able to do this. Pass. And only recently have people been able to kind of get at that. And so that it was hard and it was difficult. She told me it was a good idea, but difficult. And then, what's your second idea? And I'm like, okay, this is my second idea. And she looked at me and she's like, if you get that done, you'll get it in a top journal. And
Wow.
I was like, really? And I left her office. I had first met her and I had left her office the first time in disarray and dismay. And the
Huh.
second time I left this office and I was like so excited. I so happy. I'm like, I can't believe she said that. And that's what I did. That's the paper that I wrote. That was my dissertation paper. And I did eventually publish it in the top journal. It was a rough journey from that moment until it actually happened. But she told me, do this and whatever. And that's how she became my
She's
advisor.
your okay. Is she your advisor? I had it in my mind that Rahiv Dajia was your advisor.
Well, she was my main advisor, but she was in the School of Public Health. She was not in the economics department.
Oh,
And she was, you know, at a point in her life where she was very interested in policy. She had written a book about healthcare reform. She was working kind of with the administration, and she
can
eventually
you
went
spell her last name real quick? Is it
to
Gilead?
Gilead. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I know who she is. She's probably like super famous. It's embarrassing. I don't know, but I think I know who you're talking about. Has she written on mental health? No,
Sorry.
she hasn't written on mental health, has she?
Yes, she has.
That must be how I know her. Uh, with okay.
But so she was not like that interested in, or that like at that time on top of like the super technical
Mm-hmm.
um, details, and I needed
What year is
help.
this? This is like third, fourth year? Like
This
you're
is
in your
like
third year?
1999 or
But
1998.
this is like your third year of your
Yeah.
program?
So then, my fourth year, I wrote this paper, and on my fifth year, I was on the market.
So what's the paper?
It's the effect of education on mortality
What'd you
using
pitch to
compulsory
her?
school laws. Sorry?
Oh, using the compulsory schooling.
Yes, using
Oh,
compulsory schooling legislation. And
that's
so
that's what you pitched to her.
that's what I pitched to her.
You
Yes,
pitched to her the question and the research design.
yes, that's right.
Oh. And that's why she was like, this is a big deal.
Yes, she said
Okay.
if you write this paper, then you'll publish in the top
Well,
journal.
so how is it similar to, and how is it different from the quarter of birth, Angerson Kruger compulsory schooling kind of stuff?
That's a good question. Basically, if you look at the um, Angus-Kruger paper, their rationale for using quarter birth had to do with compulsory schooling, but
Yeah,
they did not, in fact, collect data on compulsory schooling
right.
legislation. They had a couple of cross sections to kind of check that what they're doing was okay, but their
Mm,
main identification did not really rely on compulsory schooling laws themselves or changes in compulsory schooling.
yeah,
It
right.
relied on differences in quarter of birth. And the
Hmm.
quarter of birth approach was already had been heavily criticized in
Right.
the literature at this time.
Yeah.
And, and it was problematic for an application for health anyway, because the critique was that quarter of birth predicted wages, not through education, for other reasons, in particular, because people born in different times of the year have different diseases. So as
Oh,
it turns
already
out,
that was one of the things that people started to note, or you noted that?
no, other people had noted that, you know.
Oh,
And
so
so
people were
there's,
already kind of saying that there's exclusion might be a little shaky.
yes, I mean, so there are papers that were
Oh, as
being written
opposed to
at the
just
time.
weak instruments.
There were two criticisms of that paper, one which in some sense started a whole literature, which was
Yeah,
that the instruments were weak. And so
right.
there's like a weak instrument literature that started from that. But there's
Mhm.
another criticism that Jaeger and Bound and other people wrote papers on, which had to do with the exclusion restriction. And it
Oh,
had to do
not
with this
noted that.
idea that quarter of birth predicted stuff. And so there's a paper afterwards that was written, for example, showing that the socioeconomic characteristics of people's parents differs depending on when they were born. So in the
Wow.
United States, certain families have babies in certain times of year, you know?
Mhm.
And so there are a number of patterns that already suggest that these were not like good instruments, especially for things like health.
How are you? So, okay, you've got this like phenomenal idea. Sherry's like, this is going to make you in top journal. You're excited, but at what point are you going to go, all right, scratch quarter of birth off? It seemed promising, but I'm not going to be able to do it. I'm going to go at it a different way. Like, so walk me through where your thought process was on how you got from that conversation to Sherry to your final regression.
Well, no, because it was obvious to me. I'm like, okay, well, but the whole initial rationale was that there were laws. And then you're
Uh-huh.
like, oh, you can collect the laws and then you can look
Yeah.
at changes in the laws themselves. And that's
Mm.
problematic in other ways, There are other challenges to identification in that setting, but it was not the same as quarter of birth, and it
Oh,
did
so
not
you
suffer from the
you,
same
you go
problem.
straight for the laws. Had anybody
Yes.
collected the data on the laws?
Well, so that was interesting. I found out at the time, Asimoglu was writing a paper with somebody else where they were collecting these laws, and I wrote to them and I said, "Can you share that with me?" And they said no. So most of that fourth year, I essentially spent in archives collecting this legislation from scratch, which was good because at the end of the day, I did a good job. I found a lot of information that they hadn't found.
Ooh.
And eventually other people build on this work. But in some sense, I got credit for that when I went in the job market because I
How
was
did
on.
that feel? How did it feel being in those archives and doing all that like real like, digging through books and stuff? Was that fun? I mean, because you
I
had this
really love that,
negative
but and
experience.
I really like that. And it's something that I don't think students today almost everything is now being digitized,
Yeah.
almost, not quite. And
Hmm.
it's available online, and you can do this from your computer.
Right.
I think that people today don't quite understand what this involved at the time. At the time, this involved going to libraries, looking at cards that were typed, and doing
So
all these searches.
so cool.
And then going to a library, spending 3 or 4 hours, maybe finding one article or not, or maybe and then
Yeah.
going to another library and like going to maybe another state or whatever it was to get
Yeah.
these. It
Oh, you had
was,
to go to
it
other
was,
states? You were traveling to get all these data?
well, I think I don't know if I traveled, but I got stuff from interlibrary loans from
Oh, right,
other
right.
places, but
Are you
kind of,
getting district level compulsory schooling? It's not just the states?
no, it was just state, but that was hard enough at the time to kind of track
Okay.
it.
Because that's where
Uh,
it was by the state legislators
it was
set the compulsory schooling.
legislated.
What
Yeah.
what was the variation? It's like age 14 to like 17 or something. It's like you would have missed
Well,
like in these agricultural states, is it like a lot earlier?
so I mean, these laws were in place really early on, but I had decided that I didn't want to live off of the no law versus some law because that was going to
Oh,
be the potential endogeneity of that was going to be maybe correlated with other massive changes
yeah.
in education. So I had read all this literature that kind of said the other thing that was interesting was that a lot of people had said that for a long time those laws were not binding. And part
Finding.
of the reason was that nobody was interested in enforcing them, but also there were no enforcement mechanisms. So when I read the literature, I was like, well, I want to look at smaller changes where the endogeneity problems can be smaller. And also I want to look at time periods where there are enforcement mechanisms and where these laws have kind of a shot at like doing something. And so I ended up focusing on the first half of the 20th century because that seemed to be the period where those things were true. Um,
So what
and
did you
so I
find?
collected all these data and it was fun because I'll tell you what, it had a huge feeling for me of like a detective, like when you
It
see,
sounds like it. It sounds
and you're like, you go and like you find these documents and I got so excited. Like
ah,
the excitement was less when I realized a lot of these data had to be entered by hand by me.
yeah, right.
Everything that I found. But yeah, that's what I did.
So what'd you find? What's your regression specification in the paper? It's not IV, it's like a
It
different
is
dip.
IV. It is
Oh, it is
IV.
IV.
It is IV. It's an IV. I mean, by today's standards, it's like, I teach this to my students and I'm like, this would not be published anymore.
Uh-huh. Right.
Not in the format that it was published then. But it
Right
was
hand side is schooling, like years of schooling, and then compulsory schooling is the instrument.
at the state level. So you have average education for people born in a given state in a given year. As
Yeah,
a function of the years of compulsory schooling they would be subjected to if
yeah,
they had gone to school in that year. So that would be the first stage. And in the second stage, I was looking at mortality rates
yeah.
among adults as a function of education.
Let me guess. More schooling makes your mortality go down. Is it a lot?
Yes. It was very big. That was one of the issues of the paper is that you had that standard result that the you thought the OLS was too big, and then the IV was even bigger.
Even bigger.
Although you
Yeah,
could not reject that they were the same because IV had bigger standard errors. And
right.
this is a pattern that occurs in many, many papers.
Yeah, sure. But are you at the time kind of thinking in that local average treatment effect framework? Like, is that fresh in your mind? Because it's only been out like 10, I guess it would have been out like 5 years. I mean, was your brain like baked with, oh, these are just compliers or something?
Well, that was kind of how I ended up going in that paper. But
Hmm.
the papers on how to identify compliers
Yeah,
were not out. And the
right.
other thing is that I had very few predetermined characteristics. So even if they had been out, it's not clear that I would have been able to do anything about it.
Yeah,
So I mean, I ended up in the paper, I had to explain why is this effect much larger than OLS, and people didn't think measurement error in education was a thing, and so it could be an explanation, but it would just be a small part.
yeah.
And then there was a possibility that aggregation might be it, but in my data, that didn't seem to be true. There was, of course, the possibility that, oops, you're not satisfying your IV assumptions, so you want to rule that out. And so the last possibility was that this was a local average treatment effect. And yeah, and that's kind of how I ended up selling the paper. But
Huh.
there's no good evidence of that in the paper. There's more like an arguing why that
Yeah,
might be the case
right,
type of
sure.
thing.
Was that a common framework? I mean, your Dajia is Rajiv Dajia is like on your committee, right?
He is. And so I was saying that Sherry was very interested in policy and big picture, and she was a phenomenal advisor. I owe her a lot. But she was in a separate campus, and on an everyday basis, the person who I would go talk to about everything and anything technical was Rajiv,
Yeah,
who I became very close to when I was there. And
yeah,
he was younger and he was very well versed. He was an applied econometrician and he knew all the ins and out of all these literature. So he
yeah.
was incredibly helpful to me in terms of both writing the paper and thinking about the econometrics problems, but also in kind of explaining to me um, all these worldviews. So when I was going on the market, he's the one who sat down to me and he said, there are a bunch of schools that are never even going to talk to you because they do structural. And I'm like, what is structural? Like I didn't even, nobody had taught me these distinctions. Nobody was teaching structural work at Columbia at that time anyway.
Right.
And so he's kind of the one who was responsible for helping me with all these technical parts of the work and seeing like the big picture of what was happening in the profession and all of that.
So you get this like second wind a little bit, like when Sherry kind of gives you this. I mean, because you went from this like rough graduate school experience. Does it end as a rough graduate school experience still, even though you have all this success on the, I mean, you end up having a successful job market. You end up at Princeton, but did you feel like those last 2 years were as discouraging as the first couple of years had been?
Well, no, it was better, but as you know, when you only have one project
Yeah,
and so much is riding on it,
yeah,
there were these days where you're like elated and things are working, and there are these other days where like things go wrong and you think your life is gonna fall apart.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So I
yeah.
still thought it was very, very stressful. Actually, the most surprising thing at the end of my PhD was how much fun the job market was.
Yeah, you had so much
I,
fun.
well, I expected it to be dreadful. And
Mm.
so when I finally got to it, it was much nicer, much more interesting than I had expected.
What's different? What happens on the job market?
Well, when you're a student, you eventually convince some people to talk to you, but most of the professors are not that interested in talking to you, and people are not necessarily that interested in what you're doing. And and then when you're in the market and you'll have these interviews, suddenly you have all these smart people and they're really engaging with you. They're giving you great ideas. They're fun to talk to. They tell you all these fun things about them. And by and large, although there are some exceptions, they're also very, very nice.
Yeah,
And so your professors that have been grilling you and you have all these difficult job market presentations and stuff. And then if you're well prepared and all of that, you get to these interviews and even the job talks, they go much better if you're ready.
yeah.
Then I don't know, it was kind of being introduced to society. It's
Mm,
like in the past, people went to balls and then they were introduced, and this was like you're finally introduced. You meet all these famous people that you've
yeah,
heard about, and they
right,
talk to you, and it's kind of amazing.
right, right. Wow. So you get to Princeton, and on my podcast, I have these themes, and one of them is like Princeton, where the natural experiment methodologies are from. And so you start there in what, 2001?
Yes.
And so who did you find that there was like certain professors that you kind of ended up kind of gravitating towards in terms of like mentorship or anything like that?
Yeah, well, I was hired by a group at Princeton that was doing health. So they had just created the Center for Health and Well-being. And Case Angus Deaton and Chris Paxson were leading that group, and they were working a lot in health at that time.
Mm,
And so there was a wonderful group. The labor group at the time was in the industrial labor relations section, and that was a separate, in a separate building, and I was not part of that. But of course, Alan Kruger was there, and David Carr had been there, Orly Ashenfelter was there, so they had also great people there to talk to, but that was not my home.
Mm.
But interestingly enough, the person that I ended up talking the most when I was there, kind of on an everyday basis and talking about my work was Beau Honore, who's an econometrician at
Oh,
Princeton.
you talked to him a lot.
Yes, I did.
Huh. Huh. Well, why do you think that was what was the chemistry for that? What was it about him? What is it about him?
Well, it goes back maybe to my undergrad class on econometrics. Like I ended up liking econometrics and caring about it. And
Mm,
and all of the projects and a lot of my projects have been similar where I will have data and I'll have a question and I'm doing something and I have roadblocks where I realize there are technical issues that need to be solved and I'm interested in solving them, but
yeah,
I'm not that technical. And
right.
so I have written papers often when econometricians have helped me or written the papers with me
Yeah.
because they help me with those. And so I cared a lot about that aspect of the work, and he was just the person to talk to. And the reason he was great, like Rajiv was great, and my undergrad professor was great, or Hito Imbens when I worked with him recently, is that he was one of these econometricians that applied people could talk to.
Yeah.
And he could understand what I was saying, and I could understand what he was saying
Yeah.
and try to explain it to me and work out with me. And so, I mean, we eventually wrote a paper together. And that was great fun. I learned a lot doing
That
that.
Journal of Econometrics paper on grouped on IV.
No, that was with Vivo's Drimes. That was part of my dissertation. That was
Oh,
with another econometrician back at Columbia.
I'm wrong. Okay. Okay.
No, so the paper with Bo is a paper on competing risk, and that came out in Econometrica later.
Oh, that's right. I did see that. That's great. Was that early on in your career?
That was something that we wrote when I was at Princeton. So that
Wow.
happened the years that I was there.
Okay. Well, I've talked to you for a long time, but I wanted to talk to you about this new. I wanted to kind of fast forward. I guess because I know I've been keeping you a long time, but I wanted to ask you about this new paper that just came out with Anna Azer, Sherry Ellie, Hito Embens, and Kiyong Lee that just came. It's forthcoming in the Quarterly Journal of Economics on lifetime impacts of the New Deal Youth Employment Program.
Hmm.
And I was wondering, first of all,
Okay, sorry. Roger Carter Hill. That was my professor in undergraduate. And
Roger Carter Hill,
yes.
and he
He
had
has a textbook, by the way. It's called Learning and Practicing Econometrics, and you may have seen
okay.
it.
All right, I'm gonna look it up. I'm gonna look it up. Put it in the link. Um, okay, so what is this paper about?
This paper was about a program that took place during the New Deal in the 1930s. That was the first program um, that we would classify as a youth employment and training program. So there's a
Hmm,
huge literature today trying to see, so let me back out. During recessions, the unemployment rate increases, and it increases a lot for people that are just young, right out of school, and don't have any experience in the workplace.
hmm,
So the unemployment rate of people ages 25 to 15 to 25 is typically double what it is for the average. And
hmm.
it's obviously therefore much greater. And this was also true during the Great Depression. And so during the Great Depression, it was estimated to be like 60%. And there were a
60.
lot of 60% because the unemployment rate for the average was 25 to 30%. And so for them, it was double. So
Yep.
somewhere between 50 and 60%. So, I mean, the unemployment statistics for these period are very bad. because the right data was not quite collected then. So these are just rough estimates, but basically a lot of young people were on the streets and they were loitering and doing lots of other things. And so one of the programs that Roosevelt put in place was called the Civilian Conservation Corps. And his idea was that, well, we're going to take these people, and the reason they're not employable is they don't have any experience. So we're going to train them to give them a better shot at getting a job. And in the process, we're going to create these beautiful national parks and irrigate the lands and kind of improve our national territory doing this. And so
Mhm.
it's going to be a win-win-win because we're going to improve the land, we're going to train these people and get them jobs, and we're going to pay them to do this, but most of the money we're going to send to the parents. And so there was the problem that a lot of people were poor during this time period. But this was a way in which he thought it was better to get money in exchange for work than to
Mhm.
just give out money to people who needed it. And so what
Mhm.
they did is that they went to the relief rolls, to the people, to the agencies that were handing out money to the poor, and they try to see, do they have kids of eligible age? And this was targeted mostly to young men. And so
Mhm.
this program took these kids, they would examine them and give them vaccinations and give them a little training and then send them someplace where the army took over. And the army would build these cabins where they would house about 200 men at the time. And during their stay there, so you would enlist for about 6 months, you would live there in this place, and then you would be engaged in some kind of land conservation program. So it could be a reforestation program or irrigation program, or like the creation of a national park. And if you go to the national parks, many of them were built by, the facilities were built by CCC men.
These are
So they would,
kids. How old are
what?
these? How old are these are
They're
young.
like between 17 and 25 for most of the program.
So it's basically the new deal is like we're going to do all this national park stuff and then we're going to employ all these young people.
And we're going to train them with manual skills. And then
And
in
we're
their
going to
off times, we're also going to allow them to continue their education. And if they don't know how to read, we're going to teach them how to read. I mean, it was kind of like a comprehensive kind of program. They were also, if there were local jobs, they were also going to try to get them local jobs. They were going to try to basically employ them and give them the best shot they could at like getting out of the program and doing well afterwards. So
what
in this
skill are
paper,
you getting? What skills, what job skills are they giving them? Exactly.
they were mostly doing things like building roads,
Huh.
building bridges, building houses, irrigating land, doing stuff like that, which were thought to be manual technical skills.
How
So
do
they
they
were,
get this program? Is it like with 60% unemployment? I guess it's like super popular to want to be in it.
well, during the duration of this program, 3 million men were trained. So it was huge.
Hmm.
A lot of men of that age participated in this program. It was the largest program at the time. And the thing that's interesting about this program is that after the war, this was the basis of the Job Corps program, which survives today. And it was
Wow.
the basis of many other training programs afterwards. So it was like the first program that attempted to do this thing,
Yeah.
after which many similar programs were funded.
Yeah.
And so what we try to do in this project is evaluate whether this was helpful to the participants. And that's
Yes.
what the paper is about.
Yes. What's the origin story? Because there's like five of you, one, two, three, four, five of you on this paper. Whose idea was it to come up with this thing?
Well, Anna, Sherry, and I had written an earlier paper on another program called the Mother's Pensions Program.
Mhm.
And this was a program, this was the first welfare program in the United States. And so basically, a lot of the work that I've done has concentrated on things that happened in the first half of the 20th century. And I've
Hmm.
been interested in a lot of policy during this time period. It's a fascinating period because it's the time period in the United States where you see the rise of social insurance program and redistribution programs. There's almost nothing in the 1900s, and by the time you get to 1950, you have all these programs that have been put into place. So we had been interested in looking at the long-term effects of welfare, and we collected a lot of individual data for doing that. And in the process of doing that, we came across these records for this program, which was also targeted to the poor, but is a different group of people. The first program was targeted to women with children who'd been widowed or abandoned or divorced by their husbands and who found themselves in poverty. And this program was targeted to young unemployed males who found themselves who were in poor families and were unemployed. And
Mm-hmm.
so that was another group that was very interesting to us. And so we came across these records, and so we decided to do that. And the other three people on the paper, so two of them are at the Social Security Administration, and that's because we collected individual level records of the participants in this program, and we needed to match them with records of their lifetime outcomes. And so we got permission to do that by looking at a lifetime earnings in the Social Security records. And
Mm.
so the two other people listed here were our partners from the Social Security Administration who merged the data for us and helped us do the analysis
Well, I must have
inside
left
the Social
somebody
Security
out then.
Administration.
I have Keong Lee.
Yes, Ki-Young Lee is a graduate student who
Huh,
started working with me as a research assistant, and he worked on me on many projects, but
huh,
he started working on this project and he was phenomenal. And
huh,
he was just, so he earned the right to be in this paper because he
huh.
was just fabulous. And the last co-author in that project is Hito Imbens, and the way that that worked was that we had a very interesting situation where, of course, we wanted to estimate causal effects of this program. We don't have anybody who's not treated. We only have people who served in the program. So the variation that we have is that some people serve for a short amount of time and some people serve for a long amount of time. And we tried a lot of kind of IV things that people had suggested, but never very successfully. So we weren't really successful at getting an IV. And so at some point we had this idea that we could make use of a randomized control trial of Job Corps. So in the 1990s, there was a randomized controlled evaluation of the Job Corps program, which essentially was the CCC program in modern day. And so we had this idea that they had short-term outcome evaluations, we had short-term outcome evaluation, and how did they compare? And was there something that we could leverage from the experiment to help us estimate causal effects in our
On the earlier one.
on the earlier one? And so
Nice.
that's
How
what we
are you
did.
going to do this? I've never heard anything like this.
Okay, well, so the challenge was as follows. We have long-term outcomes like lifetime earnings or lifespan, how long people lived, and we
Yeah.
had this evaluation, and we want causal effects on those. But we also have short-term outcomes, like we knew what had happened to these people in the short term in terms of wages and employment and education. The Job Corps experiment has short-term outcomes. They looked at people 2 to 4 years later to see employment, earnings, education.
Mhm.
And so it turns out Hito had written a paper. It's not published yet, but he has a paper with Susan Athey and Ras Chetty where they had the same idea. So in their paper, they're interested in the long-term effects of small classes.
Mm.
And they have observational data for the long-term effects. And in that observational data, you can estimate short-term effects and long-term effects. And they
Mhm.
also have the star experiments
Yeah.
where that allows you to get kind of causal estimates. And so in their paper, they said, okay, well, here's what we can do. One assumption one can make is to say, if you look at the experiment, that gives you the causal effect of being assigned to a small class. And if you
Yes.
compare that to the observational data and that estimate is different, maybe that tells you that your observational estimate is biased. So if these don't line up, the difference tells you something about the bias.
The
So what you're
selection
going to
bias is
do
that okay?
so what you're going to do is that when you go to estimate the causal effect in the long term, you're going to use the difference in the short-term estimates to construct a control function variable that captures the selection.
That's the y'all came up with that, and then you went to Hito, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I'm doing that too."
Well, I presented at the NBR and I was making a heuristic argument. This is how all my econometrics projects are. I was like, look, here are the results for the short term in my setting and in this setting, and you can see that they don't differ so much. So I don't think my long-term observational estimates are biased so I was making this heuristic argument, and Rashchari jumped, this was during the pandemic, he jumped on this and he's like, oh, I have a paper looking at that. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't know your paper. And it wasn't like even published or anything. But so then I got together with Hito Immens and we ended up applying that method and a related method we developed for this paper specifically. It's basically in our setting, people said this is insane. This is an insane assumption because they said, how could you possibly explain that the labor market outcomes in the 1990s, which is like a blooming economy, with the 1930s, which is the Great Depression, how would you expect those two things to line up? We don't believe that they should line up, and it's not a good assumption. So we did implement their idea in our paper, but people didn't buy it. So instead, we implemented a related idea, which was to say that we're not going to assume that the treatment effects are the same, but we're going to assume that the selection is the same. So we could, in the experiment, we could compute the OLS that we are computing in the observational data and the IV. And so in the experiment, we kind of could compute how much bias is there because of selection. And so that was the second estimator we used in this paper. And this is why Hito is in this paper as well. And so
It's really
Hito,
cool.
yeah, it took, so that's why we have all these authors, long
That's
story.
so creative. I mean, that's that's really cool. You had said to me before we turned on the camera, you said all your papers, there's like some period of them where you're in this like valley of despair, and then they like you turn them around. Was this one of them that for a while
Yes.
you thought this is not going to work? We've spent all this time on this data and it's not going to work.
Yes, many times. There are many obstacles in this project,
Huh.
many obstacles.
Well, then what's your superpower, Adriana? So you have this you say all my projects are like this plane plummeting to earth, and then they don't. They end up like being these like pioneering breakthrough papers. So like what's your superpower that makes it where you don't
Well, I
let
don't know that my
gravity take
papers are
over?
pioneering superpowers, but well, I have to say, I mean, I have a lot of failed projects, and I'm sure that's true for a lot of people. And I tell my students 99% of my ideas die, and sadly, not within 10 seconds of being conceived. Some of them, like years later, have to be abandoned. And so, there's all the failures that you don't see.
Yeah.
So there's that, and there's a large number of failures there. And I don't know, somebody told me once, was like, you don't give up, and I'm like, no, I mean, I do in the sense that I've abandoned a bunch of projects, but I was very interested in this project actually, and I learned a lot doing it. So I think that I guess the key, and I tell these to my students, I'm like, you better really be interested in what you're doing. If you choose a job,
Oh, this
paper,
gets back to the thing with Sherry earlier, even.
yes, in some
You had
sense,
not,
it was a hard lesson, and it was a
right.
useful lesson. But basically, to be able to keep this going, you have to like the project.
Yeah, it's not just that you're resilient, it's that you have taken that advice to Sherry and you've kept it really close to your heart, which is to work on the stuff that you're excited about.
Yeah, I mean, I also tell my students, I mean, by the time I publish stuff, most of the time I'm disgusted and I never want to see it
Yeah,
again
no joke.
because like I have worked much more on it than I ever wanted. And so that's why I really take that to heart. I'm like, I want to work on things that are really interesting. And if it's not interesting, it's going to be really hard. you know.
Awesome.
It's already really hard as it is, even if you start
Right.
super excited about it.
Yeah. 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 Well, this is my last question because I've kept you for a long time. What are you, when you think now in 2024 and you think back to, all that you've witnessed in the profession and in your life and everything, and you think about where things are now, what are you most excited about these days when you think about, your career or your research or whatever? What are you most excited about kind of today and looking forward?
Um, well, I think, you know, kind of from an applied metrics point of view or applied economics point of view, obviously this is an insanely exciting time. I think, there's the availability of data, we're talking about early macro people didn't do stuff. And part of it was like there wasn't really that much data, So I mean, now that I understand the history of how things have happened, part of the reason there was so much theory and theorizing was that there was not much else you could do. You had like 3 data points for GDP and that was it. You could just show the figure and then here's one theory.
Right.
So that has changed a lot, but now it's exponential. That changed during my time, but right now you have like the availability of administrative databases. You have all these technologies. A lot of the work that I did painfully in like um, collecting things by hand, entering data by hand. I mean, that's all like changing vastly. Even historical records now, we can convert them and digitize them much faster than you could before. You have administrative databases. You just have an explosion of availability of data. And that's just amazing. And the things that you can do now and how quickly you can do them, that's really awesome. And there's also, of course, accompanying that, a tremendous explosion of kind of new methods in machine learning and causal estimation. And I also think what's another thing that's exciting is that I don't think that the division between structural and applied is as stark as it used to be. There's still people who do one and do the other, but I think that there are many areas in which those two things are starting to be seen as complements, as they always should have been. And
Right.
there are more people that are doing both. And there's
Mm,
like a better kind of understanding of what are the strengths and weaknesses of this. And there's no so much, I don't feel there's as much a feud in the profession and
mm,
an animosity between these groups, the way that I felt there was when I was graduating in 2001. And I think that's also very exciting, you
mm.
know? So I think there are a lot of kind of super cool developments that I'm excited about. But at these days, I realize that one of the things that I like doing a lot is training students. So I
Yeah,
spend a lot of time with my students, and I look forward to that. And that gives me a lot of satisfaction.
that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, this has been fun. I'm so glad we got to talk and meet in person or the virtual world. This is more in person than it's been. I have to meet in real person one day. But I really, really enjoyed hearing your story. And I just want to say thank you for sitting down with me. This was a lot of fun.
Oh, thank you. This was long. We're
Yeah,
gonna
I know.
edit
This was a
this.
little.
You're gonna edit this down?
Nope. They're gonna get everybody's gonna drink from the fire hose. They gotta get the whole thing. They can skip the parts if they don't won't like it.
Yeah, well,
Okay. Well,
thank you.
talk to you later. Okay.